This Real Agriculture podcast is brought to you by Genesis Fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizer is your farm's #1 expense. Farmers are working together through Genesis Fertilizers to solve the problem of high prices and security of supply by planning a state-of-the-art nitrogen plant. Security and earnings through ownership is the solution. Visit Genesis today at genesisfertilizers.com to learn more.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Real Agriculture. Today I'm at the Ontario Agricultural Conference, and I'm joined now by Dr. Adrian Correndo. Adrian, how's it going?
Nice, man. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Hey, now you're new to Canada. You're up here since October. You're now with the University of Guelph. A sustainable cropping systems professor. You've just done a presentation, and you talked about, I guess, the focus on that economic, rate of nitrogen, that optimum rate. And, we're always trying to fine-tune our nitrogen rates. And, you basically said that's very difficult. And, we probably need to think that, when it comes to nitrogen in corn, uncertainty is king. It's difficult to sort of peg that rate. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that we shouldn't target a specific number, right? Or we shouldn't expect that there is a true value, because actually what we have is that we have a most probable EONR, of course. Yeah. We can provide that number, but the main or the core message of my presentation is, okay, we provide a number when we are making a recommendation, a prescription, but also give some idea of what's the noise around that, right? Because sometimes we could be very precise making a prescription, or sometimes we cannot, and it's okay, right? Yeah. One of the questions after the presentation was, sometimes it's okay to say we don't know, right? Yeah. And of course, I mean, we can provide again a number, but we don't know if that's exact. That is lying within our range. Yeah, yeah. And that was a message, that we should talk more about ranges with different levels of probability. We were discussing also, making an analogy with the football games, right? Yes. We have the odds of a team winning. And why with crop science we are focusing too much on the 5% probability of making a mistake? Sometimes 20 or 30% is okay. The other day I bet on Chiefs, and it was 30% that the Bengals could win, right?
If you're playing football and you win 10 games out of 12, that's a pretty good percentage.
That's okay, right?
You're a winner. Let's talk about, you mentioned you've done a lot of research, 730 trials you looked at in your work in Penn State. You talked about noise, a lot of the things that sort of throw off that exact rate, everything from weather to management. What is that noise? Yeah,
well, noise is something that we should accept. Again, one of the messages was let's face uncertainty, because it's there, right? We say that when we are doing the research, we're trying to have maximum clarity, exploring the factors of study, in this case nitrogen. But what farmers are facing in the real world is maximum variability. So, but if we are not addressing it, we are not trying to understand why we may have different uncertainties, how we can help farmers to manage that, right? So that's the goal, and that's one of my objectives on my research program. The research that I will do in nitrogen, it will be with a lot of focus on trying to understand what are the right drivers of the values, or the most probable values, but also the associated uncertainty. Because sometimes we can be, again, very precise, and sometimes we cannot, and it's okay. As I was mentioning in the presentation, we can improve what we don't measure. Yeah. So if we have a recommendation model that is not very reliable in a specific situation, okay, how we can adjust this model, or now we have the machine learning models, right? That may open again for a new, a completely new set of services, that crop advisors may offer, because they can run the models on their own. They don't need us doing the research. Exactly. They just get our concepts, right? And that's why I feel that we should convey this message, that one of the concepts that we should manage is manage the uncertainty, understand uncertainty.
Yeah. And that's again, we're going back to a football analogy again. I mean, that's what we do. That's how we set the odds, is all those factors that are put in, and to set up the odds. And farmers do have to play the odds, as you say. A couple of things I want to talk about is some of the things I guess farmers in recent years have been using, maybe to sort of help manage the odds or manage the playing field. Something like split nitrogen. Where does that benefit?
Well, with split nitrogen, the results that I was showing from a database in the Midwest, showing a summary of a couple of hundreds of trials, we have on this database a frequency of about 10%. On this database, that doesn't mean that that's a frequency in your field, right, and that's a message. Farmers should understand what's the frequency of the response of a split within their field. Right? What we found is that split nitrogen is a pretty useful technology to apply when we have high risk of nitrogen losses, right? Which is make totally sense. You are either in a sandy soil portion of your field, or you are either in a clay part of your field where the drainage, it could be a challenge, or runoff, right? If you have slope, and then you can lose the nitrogen through the nitrification, for example, splitting the nitrogen can help you to save about up to a half of the nitrogen rate that you will need to achieve the optimum yields, right? In contrary, if we are applying the nitrogen at planting on those situations specifically, we see that the response pattern to nitrogen is different and the yields are not plateauing, because basically we're losing the nitrogen. So the effective rate is not the rate that we are applying, because we are losing that nitrogen. It's going out of the crop, right? The crop can get that. So in those situations, it's a key technology. It will help to reduce the losses. It will help to reduce the optimum rate that you will need. Right. It will help to increase efficiency, of course, right? And it will help you, last but not least, to stabilize yields. Right. Because that was another part of the presentation, right? How is the yield stability across my field? And that may respond to nitrogen as well. So yield itself responds to nitrogen, of course, but the variability of that yield also responds to that.
Right.
So it's important to have an idea of that. So, for example, what's the coefficient of variation of yield? You have it monitors, right? So what's the variation?
And the key, I mean, that you mentioned was, I think, in your overall data, looking at that average response, I mean, you're probably going to get that 6 times. You may get a high response once, and you may get below, maybe twice. So you've got to factor in that noise or that variability is always going to be there.
Exactly. So that was another of the ideas. Presenting a summary, okay, we have these 100 curves of response to nitrogen. What's the frequency of the different patterns? So most likely we have this yield response that is curvilinear until yields, they will plateau, right? Will reach an optimum. But sometimes that plateau is, we cannot reach that plateau, or sometimes we have flat response, no response to nitrogen. And normally we are dropping that when we are developing recommendations, right? We are just making recommendations for situations where we have a response. But we have, I show you, 20% of probability on this database that the response is flat. And that may owe it to the initial nitrogen you have. That could be a good hint. Again, with the probabilities, not true, but it will help you to reduce uncertainty, because if you know that if you have about 15 ppm or 30 centimeters of nitrogen initially, you have a high chance that you will belong to that cluster that you won't have a response. Right? Exactly. So that's the key. I understand that many times farmers, they won't be able to put a nitrogen rate trial within their field, but they may use some of the indicators that we try to associate, understanding these frequencies, these patterns, right, as a way to address this uncertainty.
Final question, and this is the question that you addressed in the presentation. It was, based on all this uncertainty, a lot of farmers might just go on and put an extra 50 pounds on, just to take away that uncertainty. What do you say to that? I mean, obviously that's probably not the prescription that you would provide.
Yeah, no, not at all. No. Well, that was a pretty interesting question, and I would say no, not at all. I mean, or at least if you make a decision based on data, right? Because if you are having a most probable rate of 150 pounds, right, very popular rate, and then if you decide to go 50 more just in case, be careful, because sometimes, and that's something I show, that noise, it could be, if you have 150, most likely it's between 100 and 200. Yeah. So probably going to the 200, we are going to the high risk of being, with the risk of pollution, right? Of risk of excessive nitrogen.
Yeah.
So probably 100, it was the same like 150. So you probably won't need to go to the 200.
Wow.
And as I was showing you, there may be cases if you have a very low EONR that is estimated less than 100 pounds. Well, most likely that is close to zero, I would say, because the uncertainty that we saw is that along all these trials, the average noise around the EONR estimate is 50 pounds,
50 pounds.
right? Around 50 pounds.
Easily.
Right? And so it could be more, it could be less. That's the goal.
Yep.
Trying to understand why. Yeah. And let me make one more concept.
Sure.
Another thing that I try to include in this presentation is that we are very focused on EONR, which is okay because it's all about revenue, right? And farming is a business. I understand that. But when we are talking about sustainability, right, and looking for sustainability metrics, there is one variable from the nitrogen response models that we are overlooking, which is the yield without nitrogen, right?
Exactly.
So we are talking about corn, which is the most important grain crop in our rotation, in this region at least. And nitrogen is the most important nutrient. So don't you think that we should know how much nitrogen our soils are providing?
Well, exactly. You talked about that. I mean, we really need to understand our soils better, too, right?
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, Adrian, this is a fascinating conversation. And one thing is certain, the only thing that's certain here today is that we're going to have you back on Real Agriculture as you conduct and continue your work at the University of Guelph. Great to have you, sir. Welcome to Canada. We look forward to talking to you down the road.
Thank you very much.